Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another podcast of Free Soda. Today's episode is called I Think, Therefore Am I? In this episode, we will be exploring the the idea of consciousness, and hopefully we stick mostly to that topic, but I imagine there will be others. Um, I'm Harold Lundberg, one of your co-hosts, and then we have two others that are less attractive. So let's just not mention their names. All right.
My name is Samuel Mitchell. I'm also a co-host.
My name's Matthew Johnson. I am actually co-host as well.
Are you? Fantastic.
Okay.
So
So consciousness.
so let's just how do you guys think of consciousness? Just just maybe a sentence or two, like when you hear the word, you have an understanding of it, a definition in your head, right? Matthew, you want to start?
Yeah, well, it was one of those things where I wanted to make sure I looked up the dictionary definition before this podcast, and just because I had an idea of it, but it helped to see word for word how it's defined. And what is it? It's just that I don't know, just to have the ability to think and process the environment around you. That's what it is, right? And so it's yeah, and I guess that's pretty similar to how I always perceived it, but well, I won't dive into my thoughts too immediately, but yes, Samuel, you go. What's your thoughts about consciousness preliminarily?
I think that I have a similar base definition. Here, I'm going to tune my mic a little bit. Forgive me, guys. Similar definition as you, but not only just kind of general awareness, like as you would think of kind of just an animal being able to perceive itself as prey or being a predator and being able to perceive its environment, but more of an awareness of kind of, larger scale pictures like existence and the awareness of self and emotion and being. So that's how I've always thought of consciousness.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so I think a good place to start is actually just in the words. And I've often gotten confused with the two words consciousness and sentience, because I think that they're and in many places they are interchangeable, but I think that the distinction is worth making. That so the textbook definition, or I suppose dictionary definition of consciousness, is the ability to have some kind of subjective experience or an awareness, as Matthew was describing, of something. Whereas the word sentience, which is sometimes used to refer to consciousness, is a little more deep, is a little deeper, and it actually sentience refers more to the ability of having an emotional experience caused by external things. So something like you feel a sensation or something, and you have an emotional response to that, where instead of mere awareness of your surroundings. So one thing that a lot of psychologists, philosophers, biologists even have talked about is where is the line? What beings are conscious and what beings are not conscious, and are humans really the only truly conscious beings?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's sort of the big question to dive into is, and a big problem for both philosophers and physicists is how much of our universe is conscious, and then also, yeah, like you said, I think I for one wouldn't say it's just humans that are conscious. I think they're animals, the animals on our planet are conscious. And another question I'll bring up later is plants. To what degree we think plants are conscious, but um, yeah, it's certainly a challenge for physicists because we the initial reaction of most people is that rocks are not sentient. And maybe I shouldn't start already using those words interchangeably, but then there's sort of just this question of maybe they are, and how do we define consciousness? Do you have to have a neural network with neurons firing constantly to be conscious? Or is it just does a rock somehow have this awareness of its surroundings that we haven't figured out yet, that's just from its base chemical structure? I mean, because when you think about it, our brains are all just matter, where everything is just matter. Obviously, that's how the universe works, and so it's just chemicals. And so it's like, at what point do those chemicals interact in a way such that they like create consciousness?
So yeah, it's interesting you brought up plants there because there's a great book written by Oliver Sacks called The River of Consciousness. He's a great psychologist. He's written a bunch of fantastic books. And The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and others. And so, and in that book, he talks a lot about Charles Darwin, who and other biologists who explored this idea of, are plants conscious? And if you really think about, sunflowers turn their head to face the source of light,
Yeah.
and there are also vines that grow up the sides of other structures, houses or trees or whatever. They search out with these tendrils and feel for what's around in their environment. So in some sense they have a basic neural network, in that they pick up information from around them and they adapt and react to what is what they're feeling, what they're sensing. And so a lot of people have gone as far as to say that that is some basic primitive form of consciousness. So I just think that that's something to keep in mind for the time being, that when, as we go on through this podcast talking about consciousness, what do we really classify it as? And because I think that we can all agree that our consciousness is slightly different from the consciousness of a flower, I suppose. But it's good to keep in mind, why is that?
Right. And the other plant example I would give is trees. There was, I don't remember the author's name, but there's this author who wrote a book that was very popular, I think, called The Secret Life of Trees. Something about how they communicate. And so they have like root systems oftentimes where the roots are connected, and they're connected by these underground fungal networks called mycorrhizal networks. And it means that, for one thing, the biggest thing is young saplings. If there's a new tree growing in the forest, the older trees will send nutrients through that fungal network to the younger sapling and support it. And the author says that basically that root system is like a lifeline for that young tree. And so it means that, I would say, I think those trees are entirely conscious. The fact that they are like growing roots to support this younger tree. Or like you said, other plants, bending away or towards sunlight, or like trying to allow more sunlight to come down on this younger tree. So I don't really know if I have a question about the plants yet, but it's something worth noting that, yes, I think. Well, I guess I should ask then: do we think it's fair to say all plants are conscious? I mean, because we've given some examples, Harold, of like sunflowers and trees doing actions which would seem to suggest they are entirely conscious, but if you see a plant that doesn't like turn towards the sun or like open at certain hours of the day, do you think it's not conscious in that case?
Well, I actually have two quick questions. Well,
Sure.
I'm gonna do one first. What you're defining as consciousness for these plants is somewhat just mechanical evolution. These kind of systematic things that structurally the plant does that better allows it to survive. And I think that those kind of qualities or factors that they possess could really just be a result of proper evolution and them evolving to do certain things that make it easier for them to pollinate, or easier to live longer, be healthier. So
Right,
I'm not
but same
sure.
is the case for humans, right?
Well, I mean, like, it's not like these plants are thinking, oh, let me go look at the sun because that would be better for me. It's more of kind of a mechanical process that's happening within their structure and their cells that's saying turn to light to photosynthesize and then reproduce. So,
Right.
And that leads into my second question, where is there better terminology for a depth of consciousness that humans possess, like that actual ability to think on existence? Like, is there better language to use for a being that can kind of prod that idea a bit more?
So I think that was why. Sorry, that was why I was making the distinction between consciousness and sentience, because I think a lot of people forget that consciousness is that basic term. It really just means self-awareness, in the sense of being aware of some input that
Mhm.
and so it's still up for debate, but in some ways a plant
Yeah.
who reacts, that's a funny slip, um, that reacts to its surroundings does fit that definition. So I think that you're
Quick
right, that
question then.
that's
Quick
yeah.
question then. So if an animal knows I have to eat to survive, I must eat. Does that make it conscious?
Yes, I would say so.
Even if it's like purely primal chemical need basis action.
Well, if I may, I think it's unfair to say that if it's primal and purely like biological and mechanical, that doesn't make it conscious, because I would say we humans have a level of consciousness that is above, plants or whatever, because we're acting with that consciousness, but it's at a higher level. And so I think we're still acting, every organism started from this mechanical form. We all started from, like amoeba.
True.
We've just evolved to just this higher standard, as it were. And so our consciousness is more of like, we can use it to interact with humans. We have social behaviors and whatnot. But I'd say plants, though it may be mechanical, yes, and it's a form of survival, I'd say that is like the base form of consciousness. I mean, because conscious is literally defined, if I read it off: aware of and responding to one's surroundings, awake. And so if a plant turns towards the sun, that means they are literally aware of where the sun is. And it may not seem that they're like as aware of, like, they're not humans, which can pick up like facial cues and like see and read emotions, like. And maybe that's another thing we could ask, if like plants have emotions. But um, I would say, though it's at a lesser state, as it were, they're still conscious for sure.
So what is the language for the wolf asking not I have to eat to survive, but why must I eat? Is that what you would define as sentience? Because that doesn't really fit into the textbook definition of it. I just don't get how you make that
Hmm.
step with such, like, you can't make consciousness this terminology that can both hit the bottom layer of the like basic mechanical needs for
Mhm.
survival and the ability to, ponder existence. And even like why must I do these things? So is
Mhm.
there terminology for that?
I'm honestly not sure. I think um
For
but I think
differentiating
that
between those levels.
yeah, I think
Yeah, I
I
suppose.
mean the way I think I see it as a spectrum, so I think it's kind of hard to have different words for sort of an infinitely, you know, split upable
Yeah.
like spectrum. So I think that um eh, it kind of bothers me sometimes when a philosophical discussion can like be whittled down to a debate over the meaning of a word. So I think just for convenience, I mean, if you guys are okay with it, I'd rather just say like for the purpose of our conversation, we're just going
Yeah,
to refer to
definitely.
consciousness as and if we feel like we need to specify what level of consciousness, we can. But I think that you're right about the ambiguity, but um, I think that might just be something we have to put up with. Um, yeah. All right, so I thought that we would just dive into a couple sort of theories about consciousness, um, and the namesake of this podcast, I think, therefore am I. I thought that we might start there because I regard that to be well. Let me get into it first, and then I'll talk about how I think about it. The great philosopher Rene Descartes.
Mm.
Um, he put forward this theory, I think, therefore I am. And I think that one of the really the coolest things about that conclusion that he arrived at was that he spent years of his life, actually like years and years and years. I mean, I think that we often write off that statement, cogito ergo sum. I don't know how to pronounce it, but um, as being sort of very basic um, philosophy. But when he thought that up, he spent literally years of his life trying to answer the question: is there something that I know without any doubt, beyond any shadow of a doubt? Can I know just one thing? And after years and years of frustration, he finally, in frustration, said, well, I suppose the only thing I really know is that I'm sitting here thinking about finding something that I know for sure. And that was sort of the light bulb moment. Um, and it's sort of the basis of so much of, philosophy. Um, so I yeah, I suppose I get so turned on by that. So I kind of want to just hear what you guys have to say about that before we move on. But I mean, is that sort of revolutionary to you guys?
I would. I mean, it's tricky because it almost feels like, um, without giving it a second thought, it almost feels laughable. Like obviously you exist, um, but it almost reminds me of like the like conspiracy theory or like thoughts I myself and people might like to entertain the thought they might like it, to entertain that like maybe we're living in a simulation or something, and in that case like if I can think there, then I know I must exist at least. And if the rest of this world is all, composed, I myself am the one real factor. And I might be able to touch this desk and feel it. But that could just be, somehow being manipulated by a higher power. I don't know. But yes, I think in its simplicity, it is still groundbreaking. And I can imagine how it feels particularly groundbreaking after having spent years thinking about that.
I think I agree with you, Harold. I find it definitely very provocative and thought imbuing, thought motivating. And one of an art mentor that I worked with when I was studying directing for the stage always mentioned how in her art she always wanted to watch our paper mache world crumble. And I think that the quote you brought in kind of reflected how I thought about her mentality on that, and just how our perception of the world around us is so balanced on expectations and assumption, and what do we actually know, what is actually given worth, what do we perceive as truth, and like how that philosopher isolated it to the fact that I only know that I am trying to know, in a way. If I do you think that's a correct way to paraphrase
Hmm.
good friend? And I think that's, I mean, it's kind of scary if you really take it at face value, but I think it's also very thought provoking, and I think it shows that there's just this boundless capacity for our imaginations to perceive the world around us, and what is just our imaginations.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No. I think that for me it's so cool because it's the cornerstone. It's the solid rock that everything is anchored to. So, and I just think that it's really important that we start there because that's sort of where, um, yeah, at least I see it as the absolute basis foundation of everything that can be talked about. Um, so yeah, um, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to that at some point because I do have to say that it's really annoying if anyone ever says, like in the middle of an argument, well, we can't know anything, so the
Yeah.
only thing we know is that we think about it. So if
But it,
anyone ever
it
does
sort of
that,
puts at a
being
stalemate.
annoying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I may, I think I may have found an answer to our question from earlier about the difference between sentience and consciousness, and how consciousness differentiates between plants and humans. So, to answer your question, Samuel, consciousness, it seems consciousness applies to all animals, including plants who can like tell where the sun is or whatever. But sentience would be, um, that higher level of consciousness where you can feel. And it says the three psychological,
It says, what
attributes.
is it?
This is Science Direct. I also found one from the philosophical, end of in Stanford, but it was a very long like thesis. So we're here instead. Self-awareness is the first attribute. Then metacognition, which is being able to think about, reflect upon one's own thoughts and feelings, which, as far as I know, sunflowers don't do, which would seem to suggest plants aren't sentient, whereas humans are, and certain animals. And theory of mind is the third, which is capacities such as perspective taking, modeling of others' mental lives, including empathy. Um,
Mm.
and so it says the abilities necessary for sentience appear at a certain stage in humans as in other species, and brain damage can result in those abilities being lost. So not all humans are. So that's another part of sentience, is that a human can actually have neural damage such that they're conscious, they can like perceive their environment, but they don't, they're almost like brain dead in a way such that they're not sentient. They can't perceive or feel these feelings or be self-aware and reflect. um, Fish, vertebrates, mollusks, and crustaceans are other animals that are sentient.
Yeah. So the philosopher Thomas Nagel, I think, pretty concisely describes consciousness with the where he said um, that what it is like to be a conscious creature is itself consciousness. The something that it is like to be a creature is the consciousness. So it's all about the experience. And I thought that was a pretty concise description of what consciousness is. And so I think that again goes back to there being a spectrum of what it is like to be a fish and what it is like to be a human are very different things. But
Right.
so
So I guess I want to moving away from plants versus humans sort of thing. I would like to ask you guys how you think or feel about the ideal of universal sentience, and maybe that's not the right terminology to use, because we've just discussed how there's a difference between sentience and consciousness, and it's more likely, if anything, that the universe is going to be conscious but not sentient. Um, but is it safe to assume that for the time being, the three of us would say like a rock, for example, is not conscious? Or what are you guys' thoughts on that? Like it's very simple base matter.
hmm.
Harold.
Well, I mean, it's a good question because I think you can keep going down, to more primitive forms of life. Like, um, there's been a lot of scientific study into how much mold can remember, um, and there's a lot of studies in can you have a mold that replicates its own cells, and can you have that entity like remember what it's doing as it's going through a maze, and it's actually been quite surprising how much it does remember from what it picks up from its surroundings, even when you have some mold. It's weird because it's not a single entity. It's like um, you have some mold, you have it go through a maze, and then you split it in half, and you see how those two separate halves of the mold react. And
Mm-hmm.
it's been quite surprising. I'm not sure exactly what the results have been, but they have they've they have found that what it remembers and what it interacts with is quite surprising. So I think, sort of to answer your question, probably a rock, an inanimate object does not
Right.
have what we call consciousness, but I think it basically goes down as far as you can get, because I think it's a basic primal need of all living things to be able
Right.
to interact with their environment. So, well, actually, now I think about that, I'm sure that there are some very small, microorganisms that don't interact with their environment. Huh.
That they're as in that they like only are preoccupied with what's happening internally, so they don't respond to their environment.
Mm.
Interesting. But then if they're not responding to their environment, but they're using some form of like self-regulation to make sure, I'm alive, I'm working, is that consciousness?
I don't think homeostasis and like microbacteria that exist in hydrovents in the bottom of the ocean should be considered consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, actually, I think we should probably move on from the biology and
Sure.
into the more, I suppose, ethereal, lofty
Ooh.
discussions. So one conversation we've been having a lot actually is well, over the years, I should say, and something that I've personally preoccupied myself with, is this conversation of um, determinism. And I don't want to get too far away from consciousness and into vague philosophical thought, but which most of it is. But um, determinism is this idea that it's most easily explained in the religious context, that if you believe in a higher power and you believe in fate and you believe in sort of predetermined existence, and everything that is going to happen was always going to happen. Um, it's most easily understood through a religious context. And but other people think that by the way the Big Bang exploded, even though we as humans will never be complex enough to calculate it, in theory, the way that all of the atoms and everything in the universe interacts is calculatable, in the sense that it is knowable where everything would go for the rest of eternity. So and so some people find think I suppose believe in determinism for that reason. Um, and so we were having this conversation just the other day, and we were talking about what does that mean for free will, and what does that mean for consciousness and for human life. So, anyone want to take that away?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I hear, I mean, that makes sense to me, at least from a very physical perspective, that like we can predict um, where atoms are going to go because we have the original point of origin of the Big Bang or whatever, or like you can see working backwards how everything moves and therefore how it is going to move and spread out. But it's what's so interesting to me is obviously like the big talking point of consciousness is how humans are so, we're so able to be introspective and how well we interact with other people and have all these complex thoughts and whatever. And so that to me is the crazy part of like I could see, maybe if we get like really competent with physics or whatever, we can predict there's a planet that's going to form over there because we know like these atoms and these certain particles are going to like conglomerate into this big mass, and then this planet will form. But to think about that, like certain atoms will come together and then create life, and then that life will evolve into humans, and then take that into like this idea of you can predict life's fate and like humans fate. And that to me is like this whole other level that like sort of blows my mind. And I guess I don't really have much more to say than that, but Samuel.
This kind of gets into that free will conversation. Do you
Yeah.
agree, Harold? What? You want me to? Okay, he wants me to do it. I just got the okay to go into the next tangent. I personally don't. Maybe it's just because I don't like the idea of it, but I'm a believer that while this kind of predestination that is calculatable is a thing, there is kind of that undefinable variable that exists within humans. Like it's almost like a religious belief, you could say, but it's kind of unfounded. There's no data to suggest it. But I think that I personally consider consciousness to function on a less chemical, more spiritual level. Like it is a quality of humans that can't be calculated. And while it is a chemical reaction that occurs in the brain and in the body, I think that it's so sporadic and boundless that you can't reduce it to something that can be like, oh, blah, 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 this over that equals that times that. And if I had the ability to solve this equation, I could see exactly what's going to happen whenever I want. And I think that that's impossible. I think that while it is, it can be based in science and in chemical reactions and equations, these reactions and equations are baseless and they can't be defined or pulled from, people's ideas or feelings. They just exist. But those are just my thoughts.
Well, that's sort of since you might be more I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, aware of like different philosophical terms, Harold. Am I correct to say that what Samuel brings up is sort of similar to dualism? This idea that like consciousness is separate from the physical matter of the mind. I don't know. I just encountered this when I was researching consciousness. That this one philosopher, I believe, or physicist, one of the two, because both types of people have been debating this, said that the real problem is not debating consciousness, but getting into this idea of dualism. So it's that people think that consciousness is this like fugazi whatever thing that's like above the mind, and it's not like it's not physically part of the chemical structure of your brain, when like scientifically that's how it works. So I sort of, to play devil's advocate, Simon, also because I think yes, we can't reduce consciousness to an equation, in part because if it's possible, it would be impossibly difficult. But I think while I while I don't know that I believe in determinism or fate, I think it's fun to toy with the idea that, like, to a degree, although it's like ridiculously complex and it happens in like billions and trillions of atoms, um, perhaps like all human interactions are like, what if that is just like, we're made up of chemicals, and if I have an interaction with you, I'm going to like my emotional response is just chemicals and neurons firing because we're literally made up of matter. And so to a degree that like all our interactions are just chemicals interacting, and that maybe, although it's like a big stretch, it's predictable. Um,
I no no
like
no.
we
I
can't
think
predict it.
I think that is true. I think you can predict chemically how a certain person will interact with a other person, but I think free will is really the point I was trying to make. Like I used
Sure.
this example in our last argument, but for example, if you take a narcotic addict, every chemical in his body is saying, take another line of something, do this drug, and that's why addiction is such this kind of monumental human feat. And breaking through addiction and not relapsing and going sober goes against every single chemical grain in your body, and you can't really explain it. There's that it factor in a person that can get them
Right.
through that.
Right. And just again to play devil's advocate, what I'm saying is that like perhaps that decision that he makes is based off of like, why does that person make that decision? Because like let's say his family members is telling him like they really want him to break this addiction, or he's experienced things that have made him want to make that choice. And all of those experiences make him have this chemical response that's like broken down to a very like physical chemical state. Like all of his emotional reactions is neurons firing or whatever.
Yeah, I personally just disagree because the body
So,
doesn't want anything more than dopamine, and you're going against
yeah.
the grain of your own systems, your own body's reward system, and I think that kind of just disproves the point that it can be explained chemically, but that it's just a personal thought.
Sure.
So I think, well, there are a couple things there. Firstly, I think there's a difference between calculating how chemicals in our brain react, like dopamine, and I think, and there's a difference between that and the physical interaction of atoms. I think that we need to. I think that you're forgetting that we're going down to the atomic scale and not to the chemical scale. So and literally how they're bumping off one another
Mhm.
and reacting. So, but that's one thing. But the way I see it is I actually think it's pretty similar to Descartes' understanding of being. I think therefore I am. I think that part of what's so revolutionary about his statement um, is that whether or not we exist in a simulation or we don't exist at all, I think in some way or another, I think what is revolutionary about what he says is that it doesn't matter. Is that whatever form I exist in right now, I exist because I'm here. Even if I'm an alien playing a video game,
Right.
like the person I am right now is the person I am right now, and that's all that really matters. And I think that that's the same for this conversation. That whether or not all of my interactions, like whether or not I don't have free will, whether I have free will or not, rather, it has no bearing on who I am in this moment, because I am like the same person. I have the same perception of consciousness. I have the same perception of free will, and in some ways, I think that they're interchangeable. I think they're the same thing, or rather, it's just as good, because I think that I make decisions in my everyday life, and if someone were to tell me that it's preordained or it's predetermined, my life would still be the same. And so it's sort of something that I was talking to my brother one time, and it's something that it's just one of those things that you have to think about, you have to learn, think about, understand, and then just completely forget about, because it has no real bearing on the way you live your life.
Hmm.
So I think that's actually a good segue into another question I have about consciousness. The contemporary philosopher Derek Parfit, he asked this question: what makes a person the same person over time? And a number of famous philosophers have looked at this, John Locke, um, and so forth. But John Locke said that it was because a person is the same throughout time because they're building on a collection of memories, um, and experiences. So my yourself at age 18 has 18 years worth of memories, and then when you turn 25, you have those same 18 years of memories and experiences, and plus another uh, plus another 5, 10, 12,
No,
oh
there we
god,
go.
17 years. um, should have made those numbers easier. um, but what Derek Parfit was saying was that he uses the example of Captain Kirk, and here I thought I would just read this.
Are we
aloud.
talking about Star Trek right now?
Yes, we are talking about Star Trek here.
Dope.
He imagines Captain Kirk, say, who steps into a faulty teleporter and is beamed to Earth, where two captains emerge, each with Kirk's memories, desires, etc. Both of these have equal claim to be identical to Kirk, but are clearly not identical to each other, because after that moment, they have different experiences. But he goes on to claim that this doesn't matter, since what we really care about is surviving, and survival consists in mental continuity. So so another thing that to add into this equation of validity, are we real? Are we real people? Is we don't, we can't really trust our own memories. But what Derek Parfit is saying is that it doesn't even matter if our past memories are real or not, because they are our memories, and we have this mental continuity of survival where we continue through life, with this continuity. So which of those two theories do you guys agree with?
Can you explain the two theories again, each
Absolutely.
individually? Yeah.
So John Locke has a theory that just cumulative memory,
Hmm.
that you have right now. I have the memories of my whole life. In 10 minutes I will have the memories of my whole life plus 10 minutes of
Right.
memories, an experience. And but Derek Parfit had this, gave this hypothetical scenario of, let's say I was cloned, and you had no, or rather split in half. So I was the exact same person but twice, with all the same memories, and up to a certain point, and then past that point, me one and me two had separate experiences,
Hmm.
and yet they are both equally valid people. Um,
Right.
because what matters is the mental continuity from one thing to the next, the progression. So and again, this is the question of what makes a person the same person over time.
Interesting.
It's a subtle distinction.
Sorry, so the second theory is saying that the two, if you have two clones, they're still the same person, or they're. I'm struggling to grasp that. You said that what he said. What's important is their experiences, the continuity into the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but he said that makes them the same person or different people because they have different experiences.
It makes them, well, it makes them different people,
Yeah.
but so I think there's actually a good there's a new TV show, I think, with Paul Rudd. I remembered the actor's name.
Shout out to Paul Rudd.
Yeah. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Maybe it's a movie, but there's a thing with Paul Rudd where he goes to to improve himself, and
Okay.
at this fancy techno place, and he gets put to sleep, and then he wakes up, back in his home, and he just feels way better, and he's like a better person. But then there's a mistake, because what they actually did was clone him and make a better version of him. And the better version of
That's
him
intense.
was the better version of him was the one that woke up in his own home,
Hmm.
and with all the same memories. And so the whole show is this struggle between these two people trying to live the same life.
Interesting.
And so I think the real question is like, who has the right to be that individual now?
I
Is
mean,
it the one who is always him, or the one who has all the same memories and yet is an improved version of him? He's
interesting.
like slightly more muscular, he's smarter, he's faster, he's quicker. Like who has the
That's heavy.
yeah,
My first
exactly.
response is don't dabble with cloning. My second response is just because you don't want to come across moral dilemmas like that. Yeah, that's interesting because it's like the original is the original matter, the physical being. But yeah, if it's these past experiences, I see how you differentiate between the two theories now. But then you're saying like, does the memories, your past experiences, constitute who you are as an individual? Um, yeah, it's tricky. And then what I'm still struggling to understand, I don't want to go back to it too much, and we can also move on. But you said what you said about the Captain Kirk philosopher's idea about the future experiences. How does that theory define, like, how does that theory approach what it means to be an individual? I get the first one about like the past experiences are what defines an individual, and I see how that applies to the Paul Rudd scenario. But um and if not, that's fine. We can just we can toy with the first theory. But
Yeah, I mean, honestly, who's to say we have an answer to this
sure.
question? I mean, there's definitely a distinction between those two theories, um, and but I mean, sometimes it's not just a matter of opinion. It's just like it's just these two theories are both out there and both equally valid. So,
Mhm.
um, so should we
Samuel,
move on to something else?
sure. Samuel, do
Do,
you have thoughts on the Paul Rudd thing though?
do you want me to answer the Paul Rudd thing? Blah blah blah.
It's called Living with Yourself, by the way,
Yeah.
and there's one season, it's a TV show.
Hmm.
But basically, I think that the having the memories of past experience, like the genuine ones, does make you more humane, but it doesn't give you inherent worth. You know? Yeah, maybe it's dark and twisted, but I would probably think that if the other side of Paul Rudd has those exact same memories, but is a better human being, maybe he has a better right to replace the old one. I think that
Mm,
authenticity and originality are key, but I don't think they give someone more worth in the world. It's more about,
mm.
like, I feel like it's just a better person, and why not leave the better person to move forward in the world?
Well, what this also reminds me of is have you guys seen The Prestige? I know I mentioned this in the last podcast. It's one of my favorite movies.
Yes, but
Yes.
this can be tricky. Okay, go for it.
Just to briefly explain for our viewers, listeners, and Harold, um, the movie revolves around competing magicians and trying to do a teleportation trick. And Hugh Jackman's character finds a scientist who makes a device that like teleports him, but the problem is it doesn't actually teleport him. Instead, it makes a clone of him, and the clone appears a certain distance away. So the problem is he can do this teleportation act across the stage, but then he has to get rid of the original clone of himself. And so it's this. I'm really spoiling the movie at this point, but maybe I'll try to avoid spoiling the movie. But the first time he tests it, anyway, it works, and his clone duplicate appears like across the room from him, and the original goes like stares at the other guy and goes like wait, and then the clone shoots the original. So in
Boom.
that moment, yeah. So in that moment, the Hugh Jackman character, can't recall his name, has this moment of like that question you had, Harold, of like who has the right to live, the original. And it's not like Paul Rudd's living with yourself, where it's like where one is inherently better. They're in theory the same person, same body. Um, but he, as the magician, I guess he makes that choice from himself just because he knows he needs. For some reason, he thinks, there can only be one of me, and if I'm going to do this trick repeatedly, I need to get rid of the original clone. And I don't know if I have much more of a point to say than it reminds me of that, but um, yes, it's definitely a valid question of like, again, my main response is I would hate to put myself in that position, and I would just never toy with that. But I would think each one has value, but if you were forced to be there, you probably want to pick because you don't want to have two of the same person. But anyway.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about putting myself in that situation, and imagine I can kind of imagine being the original and then getting cloned. But
Right.
imagine being yourself as you are right now and learning that 10 minutes ago you were cloned and you are currently the clone.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
It would be kind of hype though.
What
It's
it
just
It'd
it's
be
so
kind of
difficult
hype
to
though.
imagine.
but what would you do like if you found out that your original self was like buried in a ditch somewhere, dead, which happens in
Rick and Morty.
living with self. Okay.
I like Rick and Morty. Anyway, I just think that
they're conscious.
yeah, they really are. It is a tricky situation, you know. It, God, we're going down a rabbit hole right now, boys. This is
What's the
We
point of the
really are.
podcast?
but I just feel like, you know, having yourself dead, but also still being yourself and replacing yourself, the self that is dead in the hole. I think that could be interesting, but probably emotionally scarring as well.
Let me ask two questions then, just to make it.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get like an actual question out of my comment. One, if you had the means to clone yourself and decided to,
Yes,
would
which
you?
I do.
Okay, then this is okay.
This is the point.
Would you shoot the original or shoot the or kill somehow the clone?
If I made the clone,
Mm-hmm.
obviously I would not. This is so weird. This is public information, Matthew. I would
You don't have to answer.
I would eliminate the clone because I would not want to eliminate myself from the equation.
Okay, just in case something went wrong with the clone. Yeah.
Hypothetically, but I feel like if there was a clone of me, that clone would be out to get me. That's all I gotta say.
Yeah, and that brings me to my second question of oh wow, I'm forgetting it. I think it was just that like what. Oh, I remember. I was just thinking about the interaction that the Hugh Jackman character has, where the original clones himself, and then the clone picks up the gun, and I assume he presets the gun next to where the clone's going to appear, so that the clone can quickly take out the original. But wondering about like why the original has this moment of like wait, don't shoot, because he's like changed his mind or whatever. But in which case, if these are truly the same person, they have the same experiences, same memories, same thought process, they're just different like matter. Why would the original change his mind? Like, wouldn't he have the same thoughts as the clone and think, this is the choice I've made, I'm going to let him do it? Or is it just like, I guess maybe that's just, I've answered my own question, it's just self-preservation, and he knows like I don't want to get shot because it's basic human instinct. But
I think it's self-preservation. I agree with
like
you.
wouldn't the humans, if they're the same person, be on board with that decision? Or
Yes, that's actually a really good question. That interesting. I mean, so I think I think the question is really about identity.
Mhm.
And like, are you the same person? And I just found this very, again, concise description of it is it continuity of body over time or mind over time?
Ooh, that's interesting.
And I think that but again, I think that it's about identity and like who you are as an individual. And now Matthew's all blue.
sorry.
And I don't mean that. I mean that literally.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway,
It's interesting. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I guess my answer to the question is, then given what you said, is I would, if I clone myself, I would keep the original. One, because if I decided to be the clone, that would suck if something went wrong and the original was the safe bet. But then also, like, since you said, if it's like, is it continuity of body or continuity of matter or continuity of mind? And it's like, if you keep the original, then you have both. Hypothetically, your mind will be the same if you're the clone, but then you'll have the same mind and matter if you're the original.
Well, I think that's a nice place for us to stop. We're going to continue this conversation on part 2 of Harold. Can you lead us out, friend?
we thank you for joining us for this part one of of I think, therefore am I, and we'll see you for part two, hopefully.
Thanks, everybody.